anyway, Laurie has had 2 careers as a photographer and a writer, and she wrote a biographical, that's what I want to say, book called Beyond the Tree. She's going to talk about today stories of settlement in America. She looked back through the history of her own ancestors, how they arrived and what happened when they got here. It's just fascinating. And I know you're going to tell us more about that.
In detail.
In detail, okay. And good. So without further ado, why don't you come forward and tell us about it.
Thank you for the invitation to join you today. I don't know where Ernie found me, but I'm glad that he did. I was thinking it might be Jody Dyer, who's my publisher.
That's it.
Could be.
That's a connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not sure. Can you hear me in the back? I was told that I needed to speak up, but my voice in general projects. Okay.
Furthest one back, can you?
Not sure how this process generally works. When Ernie asked me to do this, I thought, wow, 30 minutes, okay. How do I proceed? But I'm going to give you a little bit of my background, which is certainly relevant to becoming an author. The actual process generated the material for my book and how I handled what I found to make these stories from past centuries come to life. My career was anything but a straight line. I majored in journalism at UT, then worked for 3 years getting my feet wet as a sports editor at a small newspaper. I went back to UT and earned an MS in education. I then worked in communications for the UT Extension Service, writing for newspapers and magazines and in-house publications and taking photographs, which is still one of my passions. I quit the university, won't go into those details, went out to Boulder, Colorado, and completed an intense 6-month culinary arts program just for the heck of it, because I was ready to do something fun. The following year, I moved out to Eugene, Oregon, and started a personal chef business. Why? Because the Willamette Valley is our breadbasket. I was not disappointed. 3 years later, my business had started to build, but I decided to move back to Maryville to be near my aging parents. Frankly, I would never have returned here for any other reason. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I proceeded to flounder because East Tennessee was not ready for a personal chef business. And I found no food writing opportunities. I have 3 families. My parents adopted me when I was 5 months old. When Tennessee DHS opened adoption files in the early 90s, I discovered who my birth mother was. She and her Curry family were from West Virginia. Her information, and equally important, her parents' names and birth dates and locations were listed, which made research possible. There was no acknowledged paternity, thus 3 families and not 4. In 2015, I started my genealogical research on Ancestry.com. Much to my amazement, I found story after story after story. 5 years later, I started writing my debut novel, Beyond the Trees, Stories of Settlement in America. It is, out of necessity, historical fiction. I'd say about 70% of it is fact. I knew I would stay in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. I narrowed the stories down to 18, 2 from each family per century. I found that I could tell the story of ordinary people who collectively became extraordinary in the overall scheme of things. Where history is concerned, the more narrow the focus, the more personal it becomes. These stories involve my ancestors and extended families, but they could just as easily be about your ancestors or the ancestors of the person sitting next to you. That's my selling point. I took virtually every line of every family back to the British Isles. The Byrnes, or the O'Byrnes, then, as far back as the 1400s. And it took me on quite a ride. The discoveries astonished me, and I am not a person to be astonished. Seriously. And guess what? In those discoveries lie sources for books. When you're working with people from prior centuries, you'll find little information on the individual other than basic birth and death dates, locations, and parents' names. If you're lucky, you'll get an occupation for the males. If they fought in one of the wars, that will likely pop up. We generally don't have information on what the women did unless they're known to history. An example in one of my early Byrne stories was Abigail Adams. She and husband, John Adams, a founding father of this country, and Nathan and Rebecca Allen, my dad's 6 times great-grandparents, were neighbors in the town of Bridgewater, Massachusetts. When the Revolutionary War broke out, the Allens' oldest daughter, Rebecca Jr., 23, visited Abigail Adams, who was just 7 years older, to ask her help in making it possible for her to go south to aid in the war effort. This did, in fact, happen. It would lead several generations later to the Byrne family. This is not a pure fiction. These characters were real people from the past. Well, most of them. I filled in gaps with a few that I created. I knew I was going to have to be creative because information on personal lives were scarce. Events, yes, but I wanted this to be about people. Who were they? How did they talk? I did the best I could with dialect from England and Ireland and Scotland. Black dialect, I think I did pretty good with, having been raised in the South. What did they look like? I didn't have photographs to go by, but depending on the period of time and the families, I think I created pretty accurate descriptions of what people look like. What did they eat? Well, I just told you, I am a foodie. And there is food throughout these stories because I think people are interested in that and it makes it more personal. How did they die? You don't get information on how people died back then. Rarely do you. All my characters that died, I made up how they died because back in in those centuries, they had ample opportunity for a variety of deaths. Even today, we don't know how people died. Obituaries don't list that. You know how my characters died. My overriding question was this: what was so bad at home to make some people transplant their families from what they knew in England to cross a wide ocean to an unknown wilderness? You thought about that? I don't understand that. That blows me away. I do not understand how they could have possibly done that. And for many, it did in fact turn out to be suicide. My mother had 9 direct line ancestors to arrive on the Mayflower in 1620. Although they all survived, 45 of the 102 passengers did not make it through that first winter. Many died of disease. Some starved. Others froze to death. And the Indians killed a few. 2 years later, along the James River, members of the Powhatan Confederacy slaughtered 347 out of 1,240 English inhabitants in Virginia. And both of these situations are described in detail in 2 of my stories. Reverend John Lothrop preached in the First Independent Church in London in 1623. Shortly thereafter, King Charles I harassed the separatists into hiding, and separatists were any of those who preached other than the doctrine of the Church of England. Reverend John was arrested at a private meeting in Southwark in the summer of 1632 by the king's officers. The charges against him stated failure to preach the doctrine of the Church of England and nonconformance with its forms. He was jailed, and the crown confiscated all his property. The following May, word circulated that separatist prisoners would be offered their freedom in exchange for an agreement to leave the country. A year later, he received his release, and on August 1st, 1634, he and 6 of his 7 children sailed to the Massachusetts coast. Reverend John Lothrop's niece, Ellen Lothrop Cheever, which, if you know anything about history, Cheever may ring a bell, was my mother's 7 times paternal great-grandmother. Some arrived in America not of their free will. Thomas Ross, who came from the Rosses in the west central lowlands of Scotland, was one of these. Thomas's 4 times great-grandfather, Sir Walter Scott, was an inveterate. Is that how you pronounce that? English hater. In 1651, 19-year-old Thomas Ross joined 1,000 of his Ross clansmen who fought alongside 16,000 royalists in the Battle of Worcester. They were soundly defeated by 28,000 soldiers enlisted in Oliver Cromwell's army. He found himself on a ship docking in Massachusetts where he was destined to be sold as an indentured servant. Thomas Ross became my mother's 8 times paternal great-grandfather. Those who survived the 1600s, for those who survived the 1600s, emphasis shifted for these ancestors, from basic survival to trying to create a life and developing towns in the midst of virtually never-ending colonial wars in the 1700s. Captain Joseph Bartlett, 22, a soldier in the Massachusetts militia, was abducted from Haverhill, September 1704, and marched to Quebec. There he became a political prisoner in a massive French fortress for 4 years. Upon release, he returned to his hometown of Newbury on the upper coast of Massachusetts, where the Bartlett name became synonymous with fine leather work. Joseph would become the father-in-law of Dr. Hosea Bartlett, husband of his daughter Mary, and son of his brother Stephen. On July 4th, 1776, Hosea Bartlett, as a member of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, became the first to sign the Declaration of Independence after John Hancock, president of the Congress. He was related to my mother's white family through his mother, who was a Webster, and John Webster and Mary Shaxwell Webster, the immigrants from England, were the progenitors of Websters that were throughout my mother's family. To the south, people pushed boundaries for settlement. West. In November 1779, William McWhirter, my paternal grandmother's, my Granny Byrne, her 4 times great-grandfather, joined a group of 200 men and boys on an overland trek from the Watauga settlement, then part of North Carolina, and of course that area now is Upper East Tennessee, to an area known as French Lick along the Cumberland River in Middle Tennessee. Family members followed on a torturous water journey. William's wife, Elizabeth Ferrier McWhirter, was reportedly in the last float boat of that flotilla. All the occupants were killed after the boat was seized by Indians. Cherokee raged against the settlers' presence. William helped build Fort Nashboro, and he was one of 256 to sign the Cumberland Compact. Other forts immediately became necessary for protection. The 1800s were a time of great transformation. The country experienced increased sexualism, sectionalism there. Westward expansion and economic growth. By mid-century, the division between North and South had become irreparable. My mother's white family, as I have said, came from Massachusetts. And I love this. Thoroughbred Yankees, as described by one of her ancestors. And they were. Her great-grandparents, Cyrus and Ruth White, the focus of my story, hiding places for freedom seekers, were the first to move into the big farmhouse in Wakefield, 10 miles north of Boston, which was the epicenter of abolitionist activity. Their home became a station on the Underground Railroad, sheltering slaves on the run to Canada. There were 3 Underground Railroad routes coming out of Boston through Essex County around Wakefield. Every summer, my mom took my sister and me by train from Knoxville up to Wakefield, and side note, over to Gloucester to my grandparents' cottage on the coast. And for a couple of months, we knew about the slave hideaway in my grandparents' big old farmhouse. But our grandma would never show it to us. And to this day, I don't know why. It would have helped me in the description in my book. As it was, I had to describe it without knowing what it actually looked like. And the whole situation has fascinated me. It became personal, a source of pride. It is a source of pride. And of course, I had to write about it. In 1894, a brother of my dad's grandfather lost his young wife suddenly. Lawrence Byrne farmed marginal soil in Jackson County, which is on the west edge of the Cumberland Plateau. Jackson County is just west of Putnam County, Cookeville. But that was not the future he wanted for himself or his 12-year-old son. His brother, Lemuel Byrne, an attorney, had moved to Washington State 2 years previously. Lawrence heard about fertile soil in the Northwest, and he decided to move west. Almost immediately upon arriving in Tacoma and purchasing a wagon and horses and supplies, they headed down onto the plains and stopped at a little grocery store in Thurston County. There, good fortune awaited. Maybelle Longmire and her sister Anna not only greeted the strangers, but asked them back to their large farm. They were welcomed by the patriarch of the large Longmire clan, James Longmire, and his wife, Brenda. In 1853, James Longmire led a wagon train from Indiana to Washington. Not only was he a guide, a settler, an explorer, but also a Puget Sound Ranger during the Yakima Indian Wars of 1855-56, a legislator, and a capitalist. Lawrence and May Longmire married and had 3 children of their own. They started successful small farming operations in Washington, California, and Oregon. I lived in Eugene for 3 years, where Lawrence and May Byrne are buried. I got emotionally involved in this story and made a trip back out to Washington. I wanted to see the plains around Little Yelm, that's Y-E-L-M, where they first started farming, and lay my eyes on the Natchez River and the Greenwater River and the Nisqually River, which were the last rivers that the Longmire wagon train crossed once they got through the Natchez Pass. I did that. I had to do that. For whatever reason, when writing about my ancestors, I was able to easily connect with characters. My dad often told me I needed to write a book. I knew that to be true. I also knew it could not happen until I retired, because I would be consumed by the stories, which I was. The first 3 centuries of this country's existence was built around constant violence, murder and mayhem, I call it. I had no idea of the actual extent of it until I got into research for this book. American history, as we were taught, skimmed over the ugly. As a tribute to all of my ancestors who died in that violence, I chose to dive right into it. Early in the process, I started counting all my direct line ancestors who had been killed by Indians. I started making a list. When I reached 22, I quit counting because it was just too disturbing to know. I don't know what the final total was, and don't want to know. The count was particularly high among my white family in New England and my birth family, the Currys in Virginia, and what became West Virginia in 1863. The Curry family members settling into the area east of the Ohio River and just south of Pennsylvania, what would become West Virginia, were tough, smart, proud people. When the Civil War started in Virginia early in 1861, young Sam Curry enrolled in the Confederate Army with his uncle, Benjamin Curry, who was my maternal, 2 times great-grandfather, and 2 cousins. In the first battle of Philippi, and I think that was the very first battle of the Civil War, when the 2 sides organized in straight lines and shot at each other, like they did over in England, Sam considered it to be suicide. In their second battle at Laurel Hill, he was not having it. He had hunted most of his life with his father, uncles, and cousins. He'd been taught to focus and drop the animal with a single shot, and he became known as a dead-eye shot. So he and a friend found a large tree on the edge of the battlefield where he could hide and take down his target cleanly. He would put a man in his sights and squeeze the trigger, then he'd reload, and his friend would take his shot. They watched as bodies crumpled out on the field with no cover to reload. Sam went to his captain, explained his situation, and asked to be sent out to locate and kill Union pickets. The captain's initial reaction was to court-martial him for disobeying orders. But considering the young private's number of kills, he said he would run it by the general. The request was denied, but Sam was given an opportunity to join Confederate pickets to provide security for the rest of the army, and this suited him just fine. The last 3 generations of his extended families had included scouts and hunters of those committing atrocities against them. Now, he would do the same for the army. In conclusion, my question of why they came to this new country was answered. They sought freedom to worship without interference from authorities, and they wanted an opportunity to earn a living without undue taxation. But they faced extreme hardships they were unprepared to handle once they got here. Many died as a result. Those who survived held on to their faith and produced many children. Ships continued to arrive. They learned to hunt, to build wooden structures, to fight. They gradually moved beyond the trees. Their determination paid off. They slowly developed survival skills, became strong and resilient. You know, this is still a relatively new country. I mean, 400 years is not that old. I realized that writing this book. I lost my mother in 2021, 2 months shy of being 102. She lived 1/4 as long as it's been since her ancestors stepped foot on the coast of Massachusetts in Plymouth. This is my legacy.
Thank you very much, fascinating. Are there questions?
I have one.
Sure.
What resources did you use to find information? I would assume maybe Ancestry.com or what else?
Yes, and Googled and used the resources that came up with.
I also wanted to say, so did you give your, if you don't mind me asking, was that a requirement to give your DNA? Is that the way you did it, or did you just do it by tracing lines?
I did give my DNA, yes.
Right. I've always been hesitant to do that, but you make me think again.
Yes, I did, they do, I did give my DNA and those ancestors pop up and tracing lines.
Do you get any of those stories from Ancestry.com?
I get stories because I'm a storyteller and because I've long been a feature writer and I can sniff out stories.
But those, some of those, other than people's names, or those sorts of facts on Ancestry.com, any of them? That's what I want to get.
No, they come from me knowing what a story is. Now, can normal people, can the average person go through Ancestry and say, ooh, that might be a story, let me check that out? I don't know. I could do that. I don't know whether the average person can, I don't know.
Yeah, but you did get some good information, obviously.
But that's what I did. And I think a writer, I think somebody that's been a feature writer for as long as I was and knows what a story is, can do that by going through those lines and saying, oh, look, let me check this out. And that's exactly what I did.
Can I throw something in there?
Yeah.
I did a deep dive on my family too. And not only did I do Ancestry, but what I found really useful was newspapers.com.
Yes.
And what you do is you take your family members, if you have a sense of where they live, then you focus on that and you enter their names into newspapers.com. I found newspaper articles about my ancestors doing things we never knew about. You know, everything from arrests and fights and this, that, and the other.
That's great.
There's a ton of data there.
Newspapers.
I've done
And you wanna pay for the premium membership of that, so you really get the, yeah, I know. But that was a great resource
One
too.
monthly bill, yeah, but thank you.
You bet.
You can also contact the people that Ancestry comes up with if they're alive and find out a lot of things. We found a man who was the illegitimate son of one of my uncles, and he wanted to know about our family. It was clear from the Ancestry that that's who he was. And obituaries are a great source because they list the survivors, and you can contact them.
About 10 minutes ago, you mentioned a village or a nation of Indians.
Powhatans,
And
those in Virginia,
yeah, that, can you slowly spell the name of that?
Powhattan, I think.
Yeah, it sounds right, or maybe possibly double T, possibly not, but yeah.
What years were you in Eugene?
I went in 2003 and left 2003 to 2006.
Yeah, I'm an Oregon Duck. I graduated.
To go Ducks. I loved Oregon. I loved everything about Oregon. I loved well, don't even get me started. Like I said, I would never have come back here if it hadn't have been for my parents. And then I could not afford, frankly, I could not afford to go back or I would be there now.
Yeah, I grew up in Fort Mary, then went to Oregon.
Yes. There was no reason for me to come back here. I mean, I could go down the line of reasons I loved Oregon. the people, the scenery, the food. I call it a Disney World of food. Seriously. By the way, I've got business cards and bookmarks with all my information on it. If you help yourself.
Thank you for coming.